Good morning and welcome to another video cast from Hendy Consulting, the specialist management consulting firm to the $125 billion FPD display market. And today I'd like to give you my halfway thoughts on the role of supply chain risk in global displays at the moment. And this has been something that's been creeping up probably over the last 5 years, but it's really some of the things going on in the Taiwan strait over the last month that cause me for concern. And the degree to which now China is dominant in the LCD industry, and if you add China and Taiwan together with the withdrawal of the Koreans, then you're looking at more than 90% of capacity being across the Taiwan Straits from each other. So then what is the response from global OEMs in a range of businesses to a highly concentrated set of suppliers across the Taiwan Strait, where pretty much your backstop would have been going to the Koreans, but the Koreans are exiting very quickly from LCD. So over time, if you want to source LCD, now the risk of supply issues due to a Taiwan Straits issue are higher now than I think I've seen since I've been around. Now, the implication also then is what's going to change out of this. There have been a number of executives talking to me about potential for putting fabs in the US under the CHIPS Act, and that is one potential strategic response, although previous work that I know that I've done always says be very careful about putting factories in countries where there aren't supply lines of the materials. For example, borosilicate glass at Gen 8 is not simply around, and so you have to think very carefully about the strategic response being just simply fab building in other places. And the other conclusion I came to was the current players don't have incentives to do anything about this. So the players that are in the marketplace today, maybe the Japanese do slightly better out of the current situation as major corporates in automotive, in TV and in other places think about what their strategic response is going to be. So maybe the Japanese do well, but the Koreans already have decided their path, and their path is to run to OLED. Apple's decided its own path, and that's to run to OLED too. So it's then, by doing so, moving its global centricity towards Korea and away from China. And so you could say that they've actually solved their solution. But then what of all the other major brands? Have they actually started thinking through at a high level what they want to do in terms of changing their risk profile in terms of sourcing globally? And so that's what I want to tee up here in just a few slides. And I think the conclusion I've come to is there aren't incentives for the current players to do much about it. And so if something needs to be done, then it's either by lobbying of individual governments, or it's by the role of the key other brands in doing something to force display suppliers, even the incumbents, to do something differently. So if we talk through sort of some of the things that have changed over the last decade, China has made it pretty clear that both displays and the equipment thereof have been part of national level government planning for quite a while. And behind that then you've got the Chinese players set up as JVs with city and provincial governments, and quite decent subsidy and other packages tracking alongside displays. In Korea, it's only just begun to sort of fight back. There always was industrial policy in both Korea and Taiwan to support the display industry, but really it's stepped up now with calling OLED a national protected technology within Korea. And I think that is the sort of the agenda versus China becoming to be very clear now in Korea. And then the fact that these discussions that have been rumoured on some sort of white OLED supply deal between the Samsung and the LG group seem to be back on again maybe part of a bigger picture geopolitics situation. So in the US, this started under Trump with a particular sort of semiconductor orientation where Huawei bore the brunt of the trade disputes between the US and China. And so now the CHIPS Act, you see quite a number of display executives trying to think about how to lever displays into this package, because frankly you could argue quite easily that the display market is more exposed to Taiwan Strait risk than even the semiconductor market is. TSMC is very important for semiconductor supply, but if you add together the total LCD capacity now sitting in either China or Taiwan, you've got a very, very large portion of it. So really the thing I'm teeing up is what are major corporates doing as a response to this, because the incumbent players of their own have no specific incentive to do anything about it. So if you actually look at LCD, and this is an old slide that my friend Paul used at a conference recently, and I just like it because it shows how distributed factory capacity is across China. It's in many provinces, in many places, right? And with the withdrawal of Samsung and the LG group, so LGD now has one fab in Guangzhou, which rumouredly they've been trying to offload to some Chinese player to complete their exit from LCD also. But if you now talk about LCD, the amount of capacity either in China or in Taiwan is more than 90%. So really the only non Chinese or Taiwanese supply now is JDI and Sharp. And I do wonder whether or not from commercial sourcing strategies, now those two, both of whom are actually technically very capable, see some sort of upside in their business as being a reaction to this situation. But beyond that, you see that there aren't many other responses that you could have. If you're a global sourcing manager looking at this picture, you can turn to Japan to help solve, but that has a limited capacity and a limited capability, and both JDI and Sharp have been a little bit financially more shaky. So what is going to be the response now, and what's the limit? And this is where I'm not sure I understand what the limit of the complete response will be to this. For now, incrementalism seems the easiest answer, right? It'll carry on going in the same direction. I wouldn't be surprised to see more protectionism or more government support, let's call it that, for OLED, say in Korea, and maybe for microLED in Taiwan. There may be some more noise to try and find some sort of solution under the CHIPS Act in the US, but no signs in Europe yet of leaders really understanding that the risk they're running with a Taiwanese supply base is getting there for displays. What will the corporate responses? I mean, I think if you're a strategic sourcing manager in any one of the, say, large automotive businesses or TV businesses, the concentration of power now with BOE and China Star is very high, and I imagine that that's not a comfortable situation. So yes, you can try and think about sourcing from Japan. Eventually there will be potentially some sort of Indian supply at some point coming to this. The question is will this provide incentives for big corporates in other countries to start trying to think about putting down fab capacity, and then who of the current players would have incentives to help support them? And that's the tricky thing. I mean, I think in general the Koreans don't have incentives to play in LCD anymore, and they don't have incentives to play outside Korea. You could argue that the Taiwanese are in the same position. So I don't know, left to its own, without some exogenous force of major customers getting together and pushing this on the display industry, that they will be a natural solution to this problem. And hence all that's going to happen is LCD is going to be more and more power concentrated under the two major players in China. This is looking to become a really strategically interesting question. So finally, just a little bit more news on what's been going on in the last month that I found really fascinating. Some news of LGD trying to offload its Guangzhou LCD capacity, GP1 and GP2, and finding that difficult. That's an interesting story. But also them having to then go to their parent company to borrow money says something about the ability of getting corporate debt in Korea at this point with the current situation on LCD. Then news also this week from Omdia and widely reported on Apple thinking about moving the dominant part of its product portfolio now away from other technologies and towards OLED of different variants and types. And that's really fascinating, because that's then an Apple level strategic response to this geopolitical situation, as well as enhancing product performance. Now it'll have huge implications for CapEx spend, but I mean Apple's situation can probably support that in terms of product pricing in the longer term. But it's then really interesting on what does this mean then for all the other major US brands, your HPs, Dells and others. How are they going to respond? And even how now is Samsung corporately going to respond to so much of the capacity being across the Taiwan Strait from each other? Finally, the other thing I found really interesting in news in the last couple of weeks was a story out of Korea that Sunic may have been approved by Apple to offer an alternative solution to full Gen 8 OLED fine metal mask equipment. That's been important of late because it started out as a story based on technical breakthroughs from Olvac, then pivoted to actually the solution was looking more mature at Canon Toki, but then nobody in the display industry liking to want to pay the sort of prices that Canon Toki were looking for their equipment. And so this is now equipment players following the money, and I'm sure that will mean that there's some really interesting trade-offs between provenness and equipment cost and the sort of risks that are being taken towards the Gen 8 equipment for fine metal mask mid-size IT products. So quite a lot going on. So then to summarise, I mean, this geopolitics has been always there. I mean, at least in the last 10 years has been a very important part of the display business, but it's really only the tension across the Taiwan straits of the last month that's made it very clear, plus the role of the Koreans moving towards exit in LCD, that begins to then mean that from a global position, LCD now is looking like it's locked up in a couple of places. I think Japan might benefit to a degree, but I'm really concerned that the current players don't have incentives to help solve this problem. And thus, it's actually going to be incumbent on the major brands to try and think through with consortia and otherwise how they persuade maybe the Koreans to help set up capacity elsewhere so that you get technology agreements based on somebody who's strong but doesn't want to play in the technology anymore, but that provides alternative sources. Otherwise, this is going to look like it's locked up in Taiwan and China. Anyway, some more food for thought, and I hope you're all having a good week.